Imagine a little bit as we start off here. Just wake you up. Let's jump into this text here together in a few minutes, but I want to make sure your brains are working first. Just think, if you want to close your eyes, so you're not distracted, whatever. What is the strongest thing you can think of? You don't need to shout it out. Just think about it. Think about it. What is the strongest thing you can think of? Get something into your head. What is it? What does it look like? How strong is it? How powerful is it? How small are you by comparison? What is the strongest thing that you can think of? Same question, but let's change the word to largest now. What is the largest thing that you can think of? Again, you don't need to yell it out, but just sit there and think. What is the largest thing that you can think of? How big is it? How tiny are you by comparison? What is the largest thing you can think of? All right, we'll just do one more. Are your brains working though? All right. What is the most beautiful thing you can think of? What is it? Why is it beautiful? When you think of the beauty, how do you feel? When you think of the beauty, why is it beautiful? Is it complex? Is there a complexity, but also a unity within that complexity? What is the most beautiful thing you can think of? As we think through questions like this, maybe it's not something you sit down and do every day, but maybe you do think about these things a lot. I don't know. As we think about these things, it's interesting the things that come to mind. And I wonder what came to your mind. I'm not going to ask you to share it right now. I'd be glad to talk to you afterwards and we can talk through those things. But what comes to your mind when you think of what maybe it's the biggest thing, the strongest thing, the largest thing, the most beautiful thing? What comes to your mind first? My desire, prayerfully, is that by the time we leave here today, the answer to every one of those questions will be Jesus. If you thought of, maybe with the strongest, maybe you thought of a metal or material, maybe you thought of a strong man in a strongman competition, whatever it might be. When you thought of what is the largest, maybe you thought of a gigantic mountaintop peak, maybe, I don't know what you thought of. Maybe Jesus just came to your mind right away. I don't know. But my goal is that by the time we leave here today, that when we think about those questions for this afternoon, for tomorrow morning, for this week, that it's Jesus. That you can leave here understanding how good he really is. We are in Acts 17. Andy read that for us just a little bit ago, so I'd love to have you join me there if you want to grab your Bible. Grab your Bible, please, and look up Acts chapter 17. In Acts chapter 17, we see a passage that brings Paul into a city where there were all kinds of idols. There was somebody who lived at that time who maybe half-jokingly said it was more common to run into a god than a man when you went to Athens. In other words, there were just idols everywhere. Every time you're talking to somebody in the marketplace, you turn around and you're like, oh, it's an idol. You think it's a person, you almost apologize that you bumped into them. But they're just idols everywhere. And so as Paul came into the city, his spirit was provoked. It was stirred within him. And he started to engage these people. As we come to this text, if you've lived in Christian circles for a while, if you're familiar with that, maybe you've heard on this passage preached on or taught on before, or seen different videos about it. I want us to see that this text does not necessarily show the effectiveness of Paul's approach. It does show the hardness of hearts that are idolatrous. Now, there are principles we can learn in terms of how we talk to others and those kinds of things, but that actually isn't the story that's told here, is that is that Paul came, he saw that they were all idolatrous, he engaged effectively, and many people in the city came to Jesus. That's just not the story we read. We have been reading that story, haven't we? Throughout the book of Acts. We've seen that in the last two cities where he engaged, and yes, there were mobs and riots, and he got chased out, and it was hard, but it said many believed. We've come to see that phrase all throughout the book of Acts. Many people believed. But check out the end of this chapter with me, starting in verse 32. I think you'll see that there were mixed results. It was not an overwhelming success. It says, now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some, number one, began to sneer, but others, number two, they were curious. They said, we shall hear you again concerning this. So Paul went out of their midst, but then third, some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris and others with them. Do you see mixed results? That's not what we've been seeing, is it? And so I don't think that we can rightly take that as the point of this passage, is that this is just an amazing strategy Paul had and it worked really well, because it just didn't. I think what this passage more so is about the difficulty and the reality of idolatry. I think that's what this passage is very clearly about. Paul himself reflected on this. We'll see in Acts 18 that he went to Corinth right after this. 1 Corinthians 1, 17 through 21, Paul is writing back to those people, and he says, Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, so they can't see it clearly. Because it's hard to see clearly when idols hold your heart so dearly. So it seems like foolishness to those who are perishing. But to those who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. And then he goes on in chapter 2, the first 5 verses. And so it was with me, brothers and sisters, when I came to you. And so he's describing when he left Athens, when he came to Corinth. This is what he's describing. And he says, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony of God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. You know what's interesting? In Athens, we don't read him saying that. It doesn't say he didn't. We don't know what else he said that wasn't recorded. But it doesn't say that he preached Jesus crucified. It does say he talked to them about Jesus and the resurrection. But when he came to Corinth, he said, okay, I'm coming, and I'm just laser focused on this reality that Jesus is the Son of God who became a man, and that he died for the sins of the world, because that's your problem. And you need to be set free from those sins, and he alone can do that. And then he goes on thinking about the power to do that. But in contrast, verse 3 says, I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. I don't think he was leaving a place that was incredibly successful. He came with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on the power of God. I have to say all that, and maybe you're like, why'd you take us through all those verses? Because you hear it all the time, that put out there as though what Paul did here was exactly the best gospel presentation there could be, and that's what we need to model our evangelism after. I think the text just says there was mixed results. Check it out for yourself. That's what I saw at the end of Acts chapter 17. But when Paul came to Athens, Athens was a city. It was a very loud city. It was a very industrious city. It was very lively. But when Paul came to Athens, what stood out to him, what he saw, was their idolatry. Idolatry is a real problem, and Jesus is the answer. Verse 16, that's where we read it. While Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols. He saw the idols in the city. Now, apparently that wasn't hard to do because as it was written, it was easier to bump into one than a human, right? So it was easy for him to see them. They were everywhere, and it was a big problem. And that idolatry prevented a lot of them from coming to Jesus. Some were curious, some did come to faith in Jesus, and some just mocked. Some just made fun of the thought that anybody could be raised from the dead. Idolatry is a problem. Let's think about that here this morning. It was a huge problem in Athens, and I want us to think through this today because it's still a problem. It might not look exactly the same. You might not say, I went to Gloucester and I couldn't I couldn't help but bump into idols. Like every street corner, there's this statue of a god somewhere. It might not look like that, but idolatry is a real problem, and that's what I want us to think through here together this morning. Idolatry is not always just the carving of something physical. Now, of course, it includes that, and that's what we see in Athens. But idolatry is a problem of the heart. We see that in Scripture. Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 4, any man of the house of Israel who sets up his idols, where does he set them up? Not in the physical outside realm in the world, and it's in his own heart or her own heart. Idolatry is an issue of the heart. And as it goes on in verse 4, he talks about dealing with that. And then in verse 5, we see, in order to lay hold of their hearts of the house of Israel, who are estranged from me through all their idols. God loved, we're reading about the people of Israel back that Ezekiel was writing to or speaking to. He loved them. He didn't want idols in their hearts because he loved them. He was going after their hearts to bring them back. And verse 4 actually tells us he was giving them over to the way of their idols because the consequences of idolatry are awful. You don't want them, but God is just. And so he handed them over to the desires of their hearts, which was idolatry, and it was empty. And the point of that was that they would see it was empty and turn back to Jesus, turn back to their God. That was his heart for them, was in order to lay hold of the hearts. I believe that's his desire for us today. I believe that's his desire for those around us, who I think, as we think here together for the next little bit, we'll see probably are affected by the issue of idolatry. Romans 1, verse 25, describing humanity, it says, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who, by the way, is the one who's blessed forever. He's the one true God. But they exchanged the truth of God. What did they exchange it for? A lie. And they worshiped and served the creature, something created, something physical. And sometimes those are even good things. We look at the idols of Athens maybe and say, well, those are just awful, bad, terrible things, and everything about them deserves to be destroyed. I don't have anything like that. Well, maybe you do. We'll think through that. But maybe it's actually a good thing that God made, but like in Romans 1, you've elevated it above God. You worship it more than you worship God. You think, you love, you trust that more than you think about God. You love God or you trust God. That's idolatry. And so I think idolatry is still a pretty big problem for us in our world, isn't it? So why don't we see it? Why don't we see that it's real and that it's such a big problem? Maybe some of you are like, I do, and my spirit's been provoked all week. Good. I'm glad you see it. That's really good. And for the rest of us, I want us to think through that a little bit. Number one, I think because it doesn't always take that physical form in the sense of, I carved this and I'm calling it an idol. And so it looks a little different in that way. I think one of the other reasons is because in our culture, we have this idea of secularism that we think we're beyond that stuff. We're more advanced. That stuff of idolatry, that stuff of ancient history, nobody does that anymore. We're way more advanced than that. I think that's one of the other reasons that it's hard to see. For us as Christians, if you're a Jesus follower, if you've put your faith in Jesus, I want us to consider maybe we don't see the idols of our culture because we share them. So we need to think about what are idols so that we can think about whether we share them or not. When Paul went into Athens, he observed their idols. He saw them, verse 16 shows us, and in seeing them, his spirit was provoked, and he saw how awful it was that those things were being worshipped to the neglect of God. So I want to think through just a few. I have 3 slides of some of these Greek gods that Paul would have seen. I want to go through some of these a little bit. There are hundreds and hundreds, by the way. But I have 3 slides just to get us to think through this here a little bit. Because honestly, I think we're still affected by these same gods, though we may not have a carving of them. What about the God of time? Or the God of the calendar, the keeper of the years? How many of you, when you lost a year in COVID, maybe you found out that was elevated too highly in your thinking? My plans for this year, right? My plans for this day, my expectations. Maybe that got elevated too high so that God wasn't seen as high as he should have been. What about wealth? That's a big one, right? What about Apollo? He's the god of music, art, or entertainment for them. Does that get elevated to the point that that's all people care about and talk about and think about in our culture ever? Does that get elevated to the point that people who are in the entertainment industry are almost looked at as gurus and really wise people, and we should think about their perspective before you vote, before you make a choice, before you whatever it is? Sports. What about that one? Hestia. This is the god of domesticity. Let's think about this one a little bit. This is the virgin goddess of the hearth, the right ordering of domesticity, the family, the home, and the state. Can you make an idol of having everything in exactly the right order of what you think it should be in your house? Ooh. See, maybe we are still really affected by these things. Now, is it good to have an orderly house? Yeah, right? God is a God of order. I'm not saying that's not good. I'm saying it can become an idol. I'm saying it can drive you. You can trust your ordering. You can trust your mindset of this is how I thought, whatever it is. It was domesticity, the family, the state, politics. I think it needs to be ordered exactly this way. Order's good, but it's not your God. Adonis, you've probably heard that one, right? See, we even hear these names within our culture. The perfect mortal lover. As we go on, as we go on, we see Zeus. You've heard of him, I'm sure. The god of law, order, justice. Can justice, your desire for justice, the way you want it to be carried out, can that become a god? That can become an idol. You have others here. You have marriage, your family, your sense of desire for family. That can drive you more than God does. You can love your family more than you love God. What about the God of opportunity, luck, or favor? How many millions of dollars every year go to that God, right? The God of luck, the God of the lottery. The God of luck is in our culture. Dionysus. The God of wine, the God of wine pressing and wine making. Ritual madness, isn't that an interesting description? Ecstasy. Let's think about that one a little bit. Ritual madness? What is madness? It's when you're separated from your senses, isn't it? Can we make wine or other substances a god to the point that it becomes a ritual? And that ritual separates us from our senses? Party life, right? Absolutely. Absolutely we can. It becomes a part of that in a sense, cult culture of our country, of our reality, that can become elevated to the point that God made grapes and grapes are good, right? But let's elevate them, make them part of this party culture. Let's use them so that we're separated from our senses, drunkenness, so we're not filled with God's Spirit. That is wrong and sinful. But does it happen? It absolutely happens in our culture. Are you starting to see the idolatry in our culture too? We can say, well, we're advanced beyond that. We're this secular, advanced scientific culture. We're way beyond all of that stuff. It seems like maybe we're in the exact same spot, actually. The God of satire or unfair criticism or blame. When you read the fuller description of that one, it's really fascinating how much of our culture is shaped by that. Where you intentionally are using satire to put others down so that you can get around a logical argument. Unfair criticism. Now, there's times to be logically critical of things, right? This is right, that's wrong. You have to think critically. But unfair criticism, blame shifting. And so whenever anything goes wrong in the country, it's never the president's fault. It's always the previous president's fault, right? What about you? Right? You may be prone to that same thing. Well, that wasn't my fault. It was their fault. Think about it. Kratos, strength and power. Strength and power. That's an interesting one. That's a big one in our world. The god of power or the idol of power. It even shows up in subtle little ways about self-empowerment. Not having God shape and change us and make us who He created to be, but self-empowerment. In the therapy world, there's a phrase called self-actualization. Have you heard that one? Self-actualization is the process of becoming everything you are capable of becoming in and of yourself. You are a powerful goddess. You are a powerful God, right? Self-actualization may actually, in reality, just fall under that same God of power. I have that power. I have that strength within myself. We are affected by these. Alastor, the god of family feuds, the avenger of evil. Family feuds, has that ever happened? Do you ever, maybe, hopefully not us, but do you see people just wanting vengeance? My cousin did that. My brother got the house from my mom. All that money that should have been mine. I hope he gets what's coming to him. Idolatry. One more slide here. This one's really interesting. The God of chaos. The God of chaos. Let me read this description. Listen closely. The God of chaos is the nothingness that all else sprung from. A God who filled the gap between heaven and earth and created the first things. The first cause, the first origin, the nothingness that everything else sprang from. Does that sound familiar? Is that not evolution? Really? Interesting. Maybe it's not so much scientific advancement as it is actually just the same old idolatry that's plagued our world for years. There are so many here. I don't need to point out all of these because the point here isn't that we become, people who can master and pass a quiz on the Greek gods. Do you see them in our culture? Do you see that idolatry is a real problem? It's everywhere. And maybe some of these, we don't see them and we're not provoked just because we share some of them. Because we're affected by them. Because we've allowed thoughts or things to be elevated in our own thinking much higher than they should have been. When Jesus alone deserves that spot. And maybe it's not one of those that I listed. Remember, they had hundreds of Greek gods, and we can always create gods, right? Because humanity has worshiped and served the creation, not the Creator. All that God created is good, right? But it's not God. God alone deserves this rightful place. So what is idolatry? Idolatry is when a lesser thing becomes the greatest thing. That's my definition. You can work on your own and say that in a little different way if you want. But idolatry has this concept that I'm pulling from Romans chapter 1, where we exchange the glory of God and we say, no, I don't want that because I have this thing that I love and trust and obey. This other thing shapes my life, so I don't need God. That's what idolatry is. It's when a finite thing becomes an all-encompassing thing, you could also say. When lesser things become the grid through which you seek to make sense of everything. That's what idolatry is. Tocqueville said it comes from taking some incomplete joy of this world and building your entire life on it. There are a lot of joys in this world that are good, that God made, but if you take that one thing and build your entire life on it and let that be the thing that shapes you, that's a problem. And as Tim Keller says in his book, Counterfeit Gods, the only way to free ourselves from the destructive influence of counterfeit gods is to turn back to the true one. That's it. Because we've exchanged the truth. We've exchanged God for stuff he made, which is described in Romans as a lie. It's deceptive. We think it offers us promises that it doesn't. Their statues, their carvings of rock or wood weren't promising anything. But they came up with ideas and ideals in their own minds and attached their hopes and expectations to it. They loved that thing they hoped for. They trusted that thing they hoped for. They ordered their life around that thing they hoped for. And in the end, it was just empty promises and a lie. So the only way to free ourselves from the destructive influence of counterfeit gods is to turn back to the true one. If you need to think through this a whole lot more, I do recommend this book. It's worth thinking through. Are there ways in which you have exchanged God's truth for something that in the end is an empty promise? Or you've elevated something to a seat that it doesn't deserve, to a spot in your heart and your mind and your thinking that it doesn't deserve. In the end, freedom from idolatry comes when we can say, because I have God, I don't need fill in the blank. What is it? Now, need is a very specific word. Again, a lot of these are good things that God made for us to enjoy. But if that is what you need, you love, you trust, you order your life around, and when you can't have it is when you realize it's your idol. When you can't have the year of 2020 you wanted, maybe you realize you've given in to the God of the calendar. Right? Whatever it is, because I have God, I don't need this. And so if it's a good thing God made, I can gratefully enjoy it and engage in it for worship, but I'm freed from it and I don't trust it any longer, and it is not my greatest love. Colossians 3:5 says, therefore, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to what? Idolatry is an issue of the heart, isn't it? It manifests itself in many, many ways, but it's an issue of the heart. So verse 17, Paul then was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. He was engaging them. And as he engaged them, he encountered a society that had multiple different, actually conflicting worldviews. We see that in the Epicureans and the Stoics. So the Epicureans, first of all, the Epicureans devalued religion, thought the gods disinterested in humanity, and sought pleasure as the highest goal of humanity. Maybe you've heard the word hedonism. That's what this is. It's materialism. It's my pleasure is the highest good. On the other hand, the Stoics, on the other hand, considered the gods more immanent. They sought consistency on a rational basis and self-sufficiency. They were very logical in their thinking. They weren't just out for whatever's pleasurable. So if pleasure was the god of the Epicureans, maybe logic or reason was the god of the Stoics. Again, are those things bad in and of themselves? Not necessarily, right? But when they become the god you serve, the thing that you wrap your entire life around, maybe you have a problem. And as he engaged, verse 18, some of the Epicureans and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. Some were saying, what would this idle babbler wish to say? Idle babbler. That's an interesting description. That word is the word seed picker, literally. It comes from picking seeds in the original language. It's spermologos. Seed picker, or one who picks up scraps of information here and there and then communicates it in an unsophisticated way in the pretense of logic. We have seed pickers in our world, don't we? We can gather a quote from this book, a quote from this book. We can gather this way of saying something from this video or this way of saying something, and we regurgitate it without having thought through it. That's what they're accusing Paul of. They're saying he's just picking up these different ideas, he's just regurgitating it, and he's not really that intelligent. That's not who he is. Others, verse 18 goes on to say, said he seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. So he was there talking about Jesus, and he was there talking about the resurrection, and they said, these are strange demons, literally. These are strange demons this guy is talking about. And so this seemed odd to them. It made no sense. They hadn't heard it, or they had heard it and it just couldn't compute in their worldview. It had no place, it couldn't make sense, but it got their attention, didn't it? It definitely got their attention. And we see in verses 19 through 21 that actually sometimes the issue isn't lack of interest on people's parts. Maybe it's the presence of idols. Because they were interested, weren't they? Verse 19, and they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is you are proclaiming? There was interest or curiosity, for you are bringing some strange things to our ears. So we want to know what these things mean. Now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. Luke thought we needed to know that, so he put that descriptor there, that this was a normal pattern and custom for them, so they were interested to hear about it. They did want to hear. They were curious. This wasn't that odd to them to hear something that they hadn't heard before. But when it doesn't fit with your worldview as an Epicurean, or it doesn't fit with your worldview as a Stoic, or it doesn't fit with your worldview as an American, it's hard to see Jesus through the idols that we hold so dearly. So, idolatry is a problem, is it not? Idolatry is a real problem, but Jesus is the answer. Religions aren't the answer, verse 22 and 23. So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, men of Athens, I observe you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with the inscription, to an unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. They had collected all kinds of gods, and he said, you're very religious. One religion didn't cut it for you, so you added a second and a third and a fourth, and you're glad to bring every god into this. And so there was a pluralistic mindset that didn't really help them. Religion wasn't the answer. Jesus is the answer. Isn't that, back in verse 18, who Paul was talking about? Was Jesus. Jesus. When he saw their idolatry, he first thought, Jesus. Jesus is the answer. So as he goes on, as he has an opportunity to speak, and as they're listening, he does begin to talk about God. He says, first of all, God made everything. You see all these gods? There is a God who made everything. He didn't say what he said in Romans 1, where you've exchanged the truth of God for a lie, but he does point out that there is a God who made everything. He says, the God made the world and all things in it. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. He's Lord of all of it, all this stuff that you carve, the art that you make, that you put your hopes in, you attach your love to, you trust. You make decisions you won't make a decision without going to the God of luck and saying, give me luck first. You won't get married without going to the God of marriage and saying, please bless this. And it's just wood or it's just stone. It's just a thing. But God made the world. He made everything. And he doesn't need anything. That's the next thing he says. He is self-existent. He does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served with human hands as though he needed anything. He doesn't need anything. He's God, right? He doesn't need anything. He's not served by human hands. He doesn't live in these pieces of art that you guys are making, Paul is saying, since he himself gives to all people life and breath. The one true God is a generous God, isn't he? And he's capable of giving life and giving breath. This is who God is. But he is not a distant God which would have been shocking for them because that's why they made the physical representations. They believed in deities. They believed in gods. They didn't believe in gods who could actually engage in their life. They believed in gods who were distant, and they had to carve things so that they could go to these things and try to make a connection and worship and engage in worship with these gods. He's not like those gods. He cares. The God who made all things, the God who gave life and breath, verse 26, says he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitations. He cares. He's personal. He gives structure. He is active in all that is good regarding life, even the country you live in. Even the boundaries of habitation. God cares, and he is not a distant, far-off God. He's personal. And then he essentially says, you're mistaken if you think God is anything like your statues. You're mistaken if you think God is anything like your statues. He goes on to say, verse 28, in him we live and move and exist. Picking up at verse 27, I skipped over that. So he did this, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. And then he goes on and says, you're mistaken if you think he's anything like your statues, because in God we live and move and exist. And even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his children. Being then the children of God, we ought not to think of the divine nature that it's like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. He's not anything like your artwork. He's not anything like these idols that you've crafted. He is real. He is caring. He's generous. He's powerful. He doesn't need anything from anyone. But yet he chooses to be actively involved in creation. He's not anything like these carvings you've made, and you don't relate to him through anything of your own creation. You relate to him as the God-man who raised from the dead. He is God. Jesus is the Son of God who took on flesh, who lived in this world, not one of those other pagan gods who's an ideal and is distant and never invaded our time and space. Jesus entered our world and is written about in history, and he's real and he's come. You relate to him as the one who died for your sins, who is risen from the dead to prove, it says it's declared the Son of God with power through the resurrection. That is how you relate to God. He is the God-man who is risen from the dead. Do you see Jesus? Idolatry is a problem, and maybe you're still wrestling with some in your own thinking right now. So maybe to see Jesus clearly, you need to lay down the idol. And maybe that's what you need to do as we close this morning. Not that you get all introspective and make yourself an idol because you're that smart to figure it out, but that you hold yourself vulnerably before God and say, look at me, search me. Will you tell me if there's anything in my own life? Maybe it's my career. Maybe it's the thought of success, the way I think of success. Effectiveness, maybe it's family. Maybe it's beauty. Whatever it might be, maybe that's what you need to do so that you can see Jesus as the name above all names. So that you can see Jesus as the one who alone is not like everything else created, who is actually God who became a man, who actually died in your place to set you free from sin, who is actually now alive at the right hand of God, interceding for you. Will you worship that Jesus? Let's worship that Jesus as we close this morning. Let's worship the one who sets us free from all of these items.